South Korea will release over 22 million barrels of oil from its reserves as part of a joint effort under the International Energy Agency to stabilize the global energy market. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Thursday, March 12th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. South Korea is exploring a host of stabilization measures, as are its global partners, in a bid to better address the economic fallout of the events in the Middle East. And speaking about the economy, South Korea's parliament today also passed a bill that paves the path for investment in the U.S. For more on all this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, it's great to have you back.
Nice to be here. Thanks.
I also have Sebastien Falletti with French daily Le Figaro. Sebastien, it's been a very long time. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. Happy to be back.
Lovely. We shall start with Steven then. Steven, let's begin with details regarding South Korea's plan to impose a price cap on fuel for the first time in 3 decades, which is something you also covered.
Yes, I think it's just an example of how governments all over the world are introducing measures to kind of shield their populations as best they can from the adverse effects of this unfolding crisis in the Middle East. As you said, it's the first time in decades that South Korea has done something like this, so it must be serious. When President Lee announced this, he specifically said that this was kind of to protect the working classes and certain kinds of industries that rely on energy input, specifically fossil fuel input. Fuel price increases are what economists would call regressive, in that they tend to hit lower income people harder because lower income people pay a larger portion of their income to energy and other kinds of volatile goods like food. So the idea here is just to put a cap on just how high fuel prices can go so that it doesn't cost, taxi drivers or truck drivers or whoever it happens to be too much to fill their tanks and to be able to accomplish the work that they need to do. Energy is what you would call a master resource, in that it goes into the creation or the extraction of every other kind of resource. So when prices get too high, it tends to it can have a really negative effect on economic activity, because if it costs a truck driver too much to transport all of those onions to market, either the price of those onions then either goes up, or the truck driver then in extreme cases would make the extreme decision that it doesn't actually make sense for them to carry out that work, and the economy can really grind to a halt. I think that one thing I've always observed in Korea is that the government tends to be very kind of attentive to these global changes here. It always seems to be like a very high awareness, a keen sensitivity to changes that are happening on the global scale. The South Korean policymakers tend to just be very constantly aware of how vulnerable the country can be to economic shifts, and they tend to respond very quickly. So this is something that's very much in line with that kind of psychology.
Right. And before we delve deeper into the measures here in the country, Sebastien, for the sake of comparison, could you tell us a bit about the impact of soaring oil prices on Europe?
Well, of course, Europe is also widely impacted. But just to put in perspective, because Asia is far more exposed to crude oil from the Gulf. Just to give it an idea, basically, East Asia is around 50% of their oil is coming from the Gulf region, and is currently blocked by the Hormuz Strait, controlled by Iran. Europe actually today, around 6% of its crude oil is coming from the Gulf, so it's really less than that. But the thing is, if we are going into this crisis with the crude oil price going up beyond $100 a barrel, it has a big impact also on Europe. And Europe sourced its oil and its energy a lot from the US, from Norway, from Africa also, but they will have an impact because of the price. And we're already seeing it right now in the street. In France, for example, the gasoline price have risen by 16% since the beginning of the war. So this is a very sensitive, even politically, because We know the price of gasoline has a big impact on the budget of day-to-day people, especially working people. In France, in the past, there was some protest against President Macron that were triggered by some issue around the ability to use your car. So gasoline has a very sensitive price. So all the leaders in Europe are facing the pinch and are racing to take some measure. That's why Europe and France have been one of the countries pushing for the International Energy Agency to release this special reserve on the market. There are frantic efforts by the G7 countries to try to mitigate, at least to limit the impact of this crisis. The big question here is the duration of the crisis. Is this going to be a short-lived, just a matter of weeks, or are we going into a protracted crisis, which in that case will have impact also on inflation? And for Europe, it's a challenge because Europe is actually just coming out of a big energy crisis triggered by the Ukraine war. The last 3-4 years, Europe was highly dependent on oil from Russia, and because of the Ukraine war, had to pivot away from Ukraine, and they have diversified. And just right now, they're finding a new balance. This new crisis is coming. The silver lining is Europe is probably better prepared now than it was 3 or 4 years ago because the portfolio is a little bit more diversified. But clearly, there is a challenge about the impact on the economy, and we know the growth in Europe is already quite slow. So there's a concern that if inflation picks up, it's going to have an impact because it might even push on the medium long term the European Central Bank to stop lowering the rates. So that and support the economy. So there's all this concern. At the moment, it's still question mark about the future, but there's this growing concern for the prospect of later down this year.
Right, and perhaps aware about those concerns, Mr. Putin has suggested that Russia may conditionally supply oil and gas to Europe. Sebastien, how viable is this offer?
This is I would say this is very kind of him, but it's probably a diplomatic outreach that has very little chance to get traction, even though we have some countries like in Europe, like Hungary, led by Viktor Orban, who is clearly close to the Kremlin, which is facing also energy crunch at the moment, just before some election. And of course, some country like Hungary might be happy to hear from Mr. Putin. But overall, I would say the relationship with Europe and Russia has been broken down by the Ukraine war. And there's very little chance that this will be rekindled. But of course, I mean, Putin is taking the opportunity now to remind Europeans that you are now in trouble because you turn your back on us. So think about it. It's part of a more like a psychological warfare to send to European voters that, why did you turn your back on us? Now you are stuck with Trump, you are stuck with the crisis in the Middle East. So it's part of a longer, bigger picture, but the Ukraine war is still at the center of the conversation here. And of course, the Ukraine war will also be impacted indirectly by what's happening in the Middle East, because also it might deplete some of the resources that were directed to fight the war, ammunition from the US, financial resource, also defense spending that are necessary on the European side. If we go to a long-term crisis, this country might feel even additional financial crunch and to support their defense spending. So there's still also a lot of question mark, but clearly you can't ignore the Ukraine war, at least from a European perspective.
Right, of course. Steven, back here in South Korea, President Lee Jae-myung, he has also proposed, is pushing for that, is an extra budget to help cushion the fallout of the violence in the Middle East on the South Korean economy. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think just a few hours ago, he instructed government officials to put this all together as quickly as possible. And I think there's some administrative details to it that have not been released yet. I think it will be wrapped up perhaps a bit later this month. But The idea here, the objective is just kind of use the largesse of the state to kind of arrest market forces when they get out of whack with what the government considers to be desirable. So I think the main purpose of really what this extra budget means, and this is another thing the Korean government does kind of routinely in times of crisis, is just allocate a bunch of state funding to whatever kind of purpose. It could be to stimulate demand. In this case, I think what Lee said that he wants to do is increase agricultural subsidies and to keep a cap on fuel prices, so to kind of address any kind of revenue shortfalls that may be there. So again, this is just a way of kind of keeping the economy humming in a time of crisis, and kind of South Korea is very, as we keep saying, is like very vulnerable to these things that keep happening overseas. I mean, Sebastien said if Asia, it's like something like 60% of the crew, but I think in the case of Korea, it's like closer to 80. Like it's even higher than that. So I think this is the kind of thing that I think the Korean public like generally expects of their leaders, that they get together and they will make extra plans and kind of allocate extra funds and be a little bit more generous, so as to keep the crisis from affecting too many people too adversely. And again, this is targeted at sort of working people, people whose livelihoods are directly impacted by rising energy prices. So this is the kind of thing that, you know, has a lot of bipartisan support in Korean politics. As I've said before, we hear a lot about how bitterly divided this society is, but I still think there is quite a lot of consensus in the country when it comes to important things like this. There's very much a consensus that the government should guide the economy to the extent that they can, and that the government should be aggressive with spending to help out the public in times of crisis. So as bad as this might get, you can be confident the government that will not be like sitting idly by. They will be actively trying to address this.
Right, and speaking about consensus, we saw one at the National Assembly today as lawmakers across the aisle passed a bill that effectively paves the path for South Korea's planned $350 billion investment in the US. Sebastien, what more can you tell us? And how does this parliamentary approval look to advance bilateral trade ties between the US and South Korea?
Indeed, like a rare bipartisan show of force in a very volatile context, as Steven and I were talking about. Of course, so there is this a sense of urgency also that reaching through the political establishment, that in this crisis that is coming, there's no time to waste. We know that the ratification of this trade deal that has been negotiated since last summer with the US has been a stumbling block in order to improve relationship with Donald Trump, with the administration. Recently, Donald Trump himself has vented his frustration at Korea, and even raised some of the tariff in retaliation. So that was really like more an irritant. And so from South Korea's perspective, it was urgent to smooth that relationship by finally agreeing to that package. But of course, that package is quite of a challenge for South Korea, because it's a massive package, $350 billion, including from 200 billion also about shipbuilding, with the idea that South Korea can invest in shipbuilding in the US, but hope that will help also South Korean companies in that. But there's still a lot of uncertainty about what actually that means. How is this going to be implemented? Whether it's going to be implemented only on American soil, like the US is claiming, or whether some of this could be also developed in Korea, like the Korean administration hopes, at least partially. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how it's going to be implemented. And to be fair, also probably there are some people are thinking that, hoping that this deal is not going to be implemented too fast, because it's so expensive. It's such a pressure on the Korean economy, on the Korean currency. And in the current environment, the question is whether Korea can afford to invest so much money in the US economy. This is a big question mark. They have been working on the footstep of Japan, who has promised an even bigger envelope. But there was a lot of reluctance in Korea, and there's still a big reluctance on the Korean side to commit to that amount. So I think on the short term, the big is more a diplomatic move to show to Washington we are a good ally, we are playing the card, and we hope this is going to improve the relationship with Trump. And we know the relationship with the US is a multifaceted. It's not just about trade, it's about security. We're probably going to talk about this soon. It's about the defense, it's about diplomacy, it's about China. So of course, for Korea, it's one step, but there's still a big question mark about how this deal is going to be properly implemented.
All right, then let's talk about defense then, Steven. So American magazine Newsweek touched upon the relocation of US assets here in South Korea to the Middle East. What have you been hearing on the ground? I'm referring to the THAAD system, of course.
The first thing I always say is that the U.S. and South Korean authorities have not actually confirmed this. So, we have reason to believe that this happened. There are like flight tracking websites who saw some aircraft coming and going from Osan Air Base. And there's like every indication that this happened. I asked USFK about this yesterday, and their response was just that they do not comment on the movement of personnel or of equipment for security reasons. I mean, that's just pretty logical from a military perspective. You don't broadcast to your potential adversaries what you're doing and why. But I want to be careful not to read too much into this, because if you take a step back, it's pretty easy to just say that the U.S. is involved in a very serious crisis in another part of the world. So it therefore makes sense to take assets from parts of the world where there is not a live and growing conflict and allocate them to areas of greater need. But this inevitably leads to speculation. It leads to analysis. I mean, South Korea is, of course, facing a threat from nuclear-armed North Korea, and are very kind of reluctant to do anything that might indicate to North Korea that its guard is down or that its defenses are less robust than usual. I was surprised to hear President Lee kind of express dismay over this, because I remember, I've been here long enough to remember 10 or 12 years ago when THAAD was an object of very strong dislike among the Korean left of center. Lee's own party was very, very opposed to having this equipment deployed in the country, because they saw it as an unnecessary provocation of China, or of kind of sending the wrong message to North Korea. But after that, Lee went on to say that, express a lot of confidence in the South's military posture. He said, we spend way more on our military than North Korea does on there. We have a very well-trained, very professional cadre of soldiers, and, we have nothing to worry about. And then as he went on, he also kind of speculated, national defense is a national responsibility, and we should not get complacent. We shouldn't rely too much on external support. I mean, the reality is that for all of its independent era, South Korea has relied on the U.S. for defense support. And for a while now, since even before Trump's first term, there's been this discussion of, how reliable is the U.S. going to be? Is the U.S. going to consider drawing down its presence in East Asia, in South Korea and Japan? Is it going to push these countries to pay for more of the costs of stationing these troops and these assets? And that all kind of fit in. That all kind of came together in this reports of THAAD being taken, or elements of THAAD being taken out of the country. Is this an indication that the Trump administration really does see East Asia as less of a priority, and that they're starting to reduce their footprint here? The short answer is that we don't know yet, but this is a conversation that will continue, definitely.
Right. And against this backdrop then, Sebastien, what's your take on tensions here in the Korean Peninsula amid the unrest in the Middle East?
Well, to follow up on what Steven just said, to take the bigger picture, of course, as he said, there's a lot of speculation. We don't know exactly if this is a very temporary move just for a couple of weeks because of the emergency in the Middle East, or whether this is the beginning of a new shift of reallocation of resources by the U.S. Across the world, but across the Indo-Pacific region. This is something we need to wait and see. But indeed, it's important to put this in a bigger perspective of how the U.S. is looking at the global challenges. And of course, there's the challenge of China, and how Of course, China is watching this with great interest. The big question is whether here we are seeing a reallocation and whether the US is going to be entangled in the Middle East because of a protracted crisis. And of course, from Beijing perspective, this is would be quite a good news. Clearly, the ammunition that are being used in the Middle East, there's massive amount of ammunition that have been burned in the last few days by the US. And just to replenish these stocks is going to take a lot of time. And this is something important to bear in mind when you put this in the context of the defense of Taiwan, of the first island chain, that is one of the priorities of the US. So this is also part of the picture. I think this is not just about South Korea. Regarding South Korea, it was interesting the comment from President Lee. Indeed, as I mentioned, Steven, there was quite vocal about it, but we also kind of quickly said he couldn't do anything about it, which sounds like if you take a broader perspective, maybe from South Korea's perspective, there is a silver lining here, is that this might improve a little bit the relationship with China. It's also, we know the administration is trying to reach out to North Korea. Maybe that's also a way to show that they are basically, it cannot hurt. I mean, in that sense, in short term. So there's also some context for South Korea, for the diplomacy that can be instrumentalized here. But clearly the big picture, is how this is going to impact the strategy. We know that the US have been developing this new approach, so-called flexible strategic approach for the resource in the region. And President Lee has been saying that Korea is capable of handling the threat of North Korea, which is a way to please Trump, to please the administration in the US, that don't worry, we're going to deal with South Korea, so you can deal with Taiwan, with the rest, which is a way to frame what Steven just said, that we need to be more reliant. So that's why I think it's worth following up what's going to happen with the THAAD issue. It's early days, but there might be a lot of ramification in the coming weeks and months.
Right, I suppose we'll all be keeping our eyes on the events to take place in the near future then. All right, Sebastien, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you so much.
And Steven, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.